The morning light barely touched the gilded spines of the books in the royal library when the first alert was raised. It wasn't a public announcement or a tabloid headline, not yet. It was a quiet, internal tremor that began deep within the bowels of Buckingham Palace's administrative offices, specifically in the department responsible for the royal collection, a vast trove of art and jewelry valued not in pounds, but in centuries of history. An inventory clerk, cross-referencing a routine digital log with a physical vault manifest from Windsor Castle, noticed an anomaly, a series of entries specifically pertaining to a group of late Queen Elizabeth II's privately held jewels. Items classified as personal estate not entailed had been flagged for a condition review and remounting by a private jeweler overseas. The destination listed was Geneva, Switzerland. The authorization code attached to the transfer order traced back not to the Royal Collection Trust, nor to the current monarch, King Charles III, but to a private secretary operating out of Clarence House on behalf of Queen Camilla. This was the genesis of a crisis that would soon pit the unwavering discipline of the King's Guard against the personal ambitions of the Queen. The order was subtle, bureaucratic, and therefore dangerous. It didn't list the items as a transfer of ownership, which would have triggered immediate scrutiny from the Treasury and the Sovereign Grant Committee. Instead, it was framed as a loan for restorative work. But the items in question, a 5-strand pearl choker that had belonged to Queen Mary, and a diamond and sapphire fringe bracelet known to be a personal gift from Prince Philip to the Queen on their 10th anniversary, and most notably the lockage pendant, a cushion-cut Burmese ruby surrounded by diamonds set in platinum, which the late Queen had worn only a handful of times and was last seen in a 2018 photograph, were not in need of repair. They were immaculate, preserved in climate-controlled cases. The clerk, a man named Alistair Finch, who had been in the Royal Library for 22 years, knew better than to sound a public alarm. But he also knew his duty. He bypassed the chain of command that might have been compromised and instead reached out to a man he trusted implicitly. Warrant Officer Class 1 Elias Trenham of the Coldstream Guards. Trenham was not merely a guard. He was an institution within the palace walls. With 40 years of service, he had stood watch over 6 prime ministers, had seen the changing of the guards thousands of times, and had developed a sense for the rhythm of the palace that bordered on supernatural. He knew the difference between the authorized footsteps of a cleaner and the hesitant shuffle of an intruder. To him, the royal collection was not just property. It was the physical memory of the nation he had sworn to protect. Trenham met Finch in a narrow corridor near the chapel, a place where they could speak without being overheard. Finch handed him a folder. Inside was the printout of the transfer request and a photograph of the lockage pendant. "This is leaving, Elias," Finch whispered, his voice taut with anxiety. Not in a decade or more has anything from the Queen's personal trust been sent overseas for work without at least 3 signatures from the trust. This only has one. It's Camilla's man. Trenham studied the document, his face an unreadable mask. He knew the protocols for transporting royal assets. There were specific shipping containers, specific insurance waivers, and specific escorts. This request bypassed the standard security protocols, opting instead for a private courier service. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a wealthy individual shipping personal effects. But these were not personal effects. They were heirlooms of the crown. Trenham nodded, handing the folder back. "Say nothing," he instructed. "Let them process the paperwork. Let them pack the box. It's easier to catch a fox if you let it go for the chicken first." He wasn't interested in stopping a rumor. He needed to stop a physical transfer. Over the next 72 hours, Trenham utilized a network of contacts built over 4 decades. The palace operates on a layer of visible staff, the ones in livery and suits, and an invisible layer of support staff, electricians, plumbers, and the security detail that monitors the 24-hour CCTV feeds. Trenham spoke to a man in the loading bay. He learned that a crate, marked as antique timepieces and chronometers, was scheduled for pickup by a Swiss logistics company at 3 a.m. 3 days hence, from a secondary gate rarely used by official royal processions. The timing was deliberate. 3 a.m. was when the changing of the guard was at its quietest, and the night staff were focused on their tea breaks. On the night of the planned transfer, London was slick with a cold autumn rain. The lights of the city reflected off the wet pavement of the mall. Warrant Officer Trenham was not in his formal scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. He was dressed in his standard-issue dark-duty uniform, the one worn by the guards when they were working, not parading. He positioned himself not at the front of the palace, but in the shadow of a maintenance shed near the deliveries entrance, the very gate identified by his contact. At 10 minutes to 3, the silence was broken by the hum of an unmarked white van. It pulled up to the gate, its headlights cutting through the rain. A figure emerged from the palace door, a man in a long coat, clutching a small foam-padded crate no larger than a wine box. Inside that crate, Trenham knew, was a fortune in rubies and diamonds and a piece of the late Queen's soul. As the man approached the van, Trenham stepped out of the shadows. "Evening," he said, his voice calm, cutting through the hiss of the rain. The man from the palace jumped, startled. The driver of the van, sensing trouble, remained in his seat. "I need to see the manifest for that crate," Trenham continued, stepping into the dim light emanating from the open van door. The man, a junior aide Trenham recognized from the Queen's household, stammered. "This is authorized. It's a diplomatic shipment. Cultural exchange." He clutched the box tighter, a defensive gesture. "Step aside, Sergeant. You're interfering with the Queen's consort's personal business." Trenham didn't move. He was a solid wall of muscle and tradition. "With respect, sir, that box leaves this property over my dead body, or it leaves with a signed override from the Sovereign Grant Committee and the Lord Chamberlain's office. I have the list of what's in that box. The lockage pendant isn't a timepiece, and it isn't a cultural exchange. It's Crown property." The aide's face went pale, the blood draining away in the cold light. He was just a messenger, a cog in a machine he didn't fully understand. He had been told to collect a box and hand it over. He hadn't been told he would have to argue with a man who had medals on his chest for service in Northern Ireland and the Gulf War. The standoff lasted for a full 3 minutes, an eternity in the dead of night. Trenham didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stated facts. "If you put that box in that van, I will radio the Central Command. They will close the gates. The Metropolitan Police will be here in 4 minutes. They will search the van. They will find the Queen's jewels. And you will be arrested for theft. Not smuggling, theft. It's a maximum sentence of 14 years. The aide looked at the van, looked at the box, and looked at the absolute certainty in Trenham's eyes. He crumbled. He turned around and walked back through the palace door, the crate still in his hands. Trenham watched him go, then turned his gaze to the van driver. "The job's canceled. Drive away." The van driver, not needing to be told twice, put the vehicle in gear and disappeared into the rainy London night. The immediate crisis was averted, and the jewels had not left the premises. But Trenham knew this was not the end. It was merely the opening skirmish. The man in the coat would report back to his superiors. Camilla would be furious. The political fallout was about to begin, and a simple warrant officer had just made himself an enemy in the highest echelons of the royal household. The following morning, the atmosphere within the palace was electric, with a tension that had nothing to do with the public-facing duties. Trenham was summoned not to a briefing room, but to a private meeting in a small, wood-paneled anteroom near the Queen's Gallery. He expected hostility. Instead, he found an unexpected ally. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, was seated in a high-backed chair, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She was known for her no-nonsense attitude, her relentless work ethic, and her fierce protection of her mother's legacy. Beside her stood Sir Clive Alderton, the king's principal private secretary, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Warrant Officer Trenham," Anne said, her voice crisp. "I understand you had a busy night." "Ma'am," Trenham replied, standing at attention, "I was performing my duty to protect Crown property." Anne nodded, a slight, approving smile on her lips. She gestured to a folder on the table, the same folder Finch had shown Trenham. "My mother," she stated, "was very specific about certain items. The lockage pendant in particular. She wore it at a time of great personal significance. She left written instructions that it was not to be worn by anyone else for a period of 10 years following her passing, a period of respect. That period is not yet up." She looked at Sir Clive. "So, I'd explain to me how it ended up in a crate at 3 a.m. labeled as a clock?" Sir Clive cleared his throat. He explained that the Queen Consort had expressed a desire to curate certain pieces for an exhibition of royal jewelry planned for a museum in Zurich. He insisted it was a misunderstanding, an administrative overstep by overeager staff who had misinterpreted the cultural exhibition brief. Trenham listened, his face giving nothing away. He knew a political cover story when he heard one. This wasn't an exhibition, it was an extraction. The destination, Geneva, not Zurich, was a key detail. Geneva is a hub for private sales and auctions, not public museum exhibitions. The jewels weren't going on display, they were potentially going on the block, or worse, into a private collection where they would be lost to the British people forever. The Princess Anne was not buying the explanation either. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "The jewels are to be returned to the central vaults of the royal collection," she ordered. "They are not to be moved, loaned, or curated without a direct written order from the king countersigned by myself. Is that understood?" Sir Clive nodded, his face pale. As Trenham turned to leave, Anne stopped him. "Well done," she said quietly. "My mother trusted the guards. It seems she was right to." For a brief moment, it seemed the matter was closed. But the story was far from over. The failed midnight transfer had exposed a scheme, but it hadn't resolved the underlying ambition. Inside Clarence House, the household of Queen Camilla, the mood was one of suppressed fury. The aide who had carried the crate was reassigned to menial duties within a week. The private secretary who had signed the order went on extended leave. But the source of the order, the desire to possess and control the late Queen's most iconic jewels, remained. There were other items, other estates. Ray Mill House, the Queen's private residence in Wiltshire, was not subject to the same level of scrutiny as the royal palaces. It was there, investigators would later suspect, that other items had already been moved, slipping through the cracks of the inventory system months earlier. Trenham, now wary and watchful, couldn't let it go. He had stopped one shipment, but the paperwork trail he had seen suggested a pattern. He requested permission to conduct a quiet, off-book audit of items that had been transferred to Ray Mill House for the Queen's personal use over the preceding 18 months. The request was denied by the Lord Chamberlain's office, which was eager to avoid embarrassing the royal family further. But Trenham had friends in the archives like Alistair Finch. Finch, working late at night, cross-referenced delivery dockets with the master inventory. What he found was staggering. A Georgian diamond stomacher brooch, a set of aquamarine clips that had been a gift from the Queen Mother, and a small, leather-bound journal belonging to Queen Elizabeth II. Items that had been logged out as transferred to private residence for wear by H.M. the Queen Consort. But these items were not personal gifts. They were part of the hereditary trust. Trenham now had a choice. He could present this evidence through official channels, where it would likely be buried by courtiers desperate to protect the monarchy's image. Or he could take a more direct approach. He chose the direct approach. He contacted a senior officer in the Metropolitan